As we go about tackling this problem and looking at whether we should build this highway or not, we need to look at certain impacts and begin to think about ways in which we can cost certain measurables and immeasurables. So we'll begin by looking at the current costs. And we have to ask ourselves, what does this public good currently cost us? Okay. And one way of doing that is what's known as cash flow accounting, where you simply add up the cost and you add up the cost, you add up the revenue, and you subtract them. This method uses only the revenue streams as a method of analysis. However, there are other pieces to consider when we look at a cost-benefit analysis. And in this particular lecture, I'll be looking at perfect markets and imperfect markets. A social marginal cost is a cost that is borne by not just the producer, but to society as a whole. All right, and that's often the case. When we build a highway, it is not just the producer and the consumer, in other words, the driver that's affected, but it's the owners of land, it's nature, and it's all these other pieces that are affected by the construction of this particular good. Okay, so that's called a marginal cost, a social marginal cost. In other words, what is the cost to society by producing one more extra unit of this particular thing? So that could be an extra mile of highway. What is the cost, not only in terms of finances, but in terms of the environment and these other pieces, by one extra unit of this good? So we have to ask ourselves, if not only in terms of what the cost is to the environment, but also when we talk about marginal costs, what are the costs or the opportunities of the resources being used in other areas? And I'll talk about this in a bit more detail, and it'll make a bit more sense as we go through, okay? But all you need to know for now is that the social marginal cost, in other words, the cost to society by producing one extra unit in a perfect market, is exactly the same as the cost price. So let's talk about this. Right now we're in a perfect market. We're going to look at the market for cement. Okay, this is a perfect market. And it's perfect because the supply and the demand are in perfect equilibrium. In other words, for every 1 unit of cement, we have one price. We have a cost price that is the most efficient use of our resources. This is what's known as a perfect market. Okay, now in this perfect market, if a bag of cement is $100, then the total cement cost will be $100 million if we're buying 1 million bags of cement, right? In a perfect market, the price is the same as the marginal cost. Now, the marginal cost is the cost of producing one more unit of the good. So, essentially, everything is equal. There's nothing left out. Everything is the most efficient in a perfect market. And that's the most important thing to take away from this. So the price is equal to the marginal cost. Now, this may help you understand a little bit better when we talk about an imperfect market. For example, in the case of an imperfect market, let's say that the government instituted a minimum wage. In other words, a price floor of $20 per hour for the construction workers. So we would see that, for example, the construction workers at the most efficient in a perfect market would be working for $15 an hour, but the government has intervened with their policy and instituted a price floor. We know from the price floor that we immediately have a surplus. In other words, we have a high supply of labor, of workers, and we have a low demand of workers. So there's a surplus. Okay, there's too many workers. However, the price is the same. So in other words, we have a surplus of workers. Okay. Now, what that means for us is that we have something called an opportunity cost, is the difference between what they would earn if there was no government intervention and what they currently earn, which in this case is $5. All right. So the opportunity cost for unemployed workers is the difference between the equilibrium wage and the new wage, in other words, $5. So some of those workers could be working on this project, but they do not have access to the project. However, the government is still paying for those workers for the lack of employment that they have, right? So they're sitting at home watching TV and they will still be earning from the government, taking out without producing from the government, right? So this is what's called an opportunity cost, the cost of them not doing the work that they are employed to do, but other things, okay? In other words, another way of thinking about this in terms of the concrete, we could buy the concrete for the highway, but that concrete could also be used for other uses, right? So there's an opportunity cost for using it for the highway that we pay as opposed to using it somewhere else, okay? Now, to think about how we put a number to this, right? So if the opportunity cost is $5 per hour for unemployed and $20 for employed people, and we have 1 million labor hours, we have to figure out what the actual cost of this is in money terms, right? So let's assume that 500,000 hours are being used for those that are employed, and 500,000 hours are used for those that are unemployed. We're still paying for those people, right? So we have $20 times 500,000 hours plus $5 times 500,000 hours gives us $12.5 million. Even though the government is paying out $20 million in cash, the government is paying $20 million, all right? But they're only getting $12.5 million in value. And I'll explain that in a bit. So the takeaway from this slide is that the government is paying $20 million, but in actual fact, $7.5 million is getting lost because of their price floor, okay? And that $7.5 million comes from the $15, okay? Now let's talk about that in this graph, because that may help you make a bit more sense. So notice that at the equilibrium, 1 unit of labor at $15 an hour would be an equilibrium price, but the government has instituted a $20 price floor per hour. So there's a gap, the $5 gap, and this $5 gap represents the $7.5 million transfer to unemployed people over the 500,000 hours. So in actual fact, the government is they're spending $20 million, but $7.5 million is being lost in terms of their value, in terms of the value that they're drawing out of this project. And so the real cost is not 20 million, the real cost is 12.5 million at this particular wage. And that's the difference between a perfect market and an imperfect market. It helps us to see the leakages that occur in the market.